Hey guys, tonight we step into a story that seems almost impossible to believe. We're moving slowly now through quiet forests, across villages that no longer exist, and into the ruined homes of a war that swallowed entire generations. You probably won't survive this night without a reminder of how fragile normal life can be, because the figure at the heart of our first story was only 6 years old when war consumed his world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, share your location and the local time in the comments. I'd love to know exactly where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sergey Aleshkov was born in 1936 in the small village of Grin in the Kaluga region of Russia, about 200 kilometers southwest of Moscow. His world was not extraordinary. The houses in Grin were mostly one-room wooden huts, warmed by stoves that doubled as cooking surfaces. Families shared walls, ovens, tools, and often children themselves. Villagers lived through the rhythm of the seasons, sowing in spring, weeding and hay cutting in summer, harvest in autumn, and long firewood-heavy winters, where survival depended on stored potatoes, beets, onions, and whatever grain could be hidden from the quotas demanded by Moscow. It was not a glamorous life, but it was a stable one. Children in villages like Grin grew up carrying water from the well, chasing chickens in courtyards, and learning to work alongside parents before they could even read. Sergey was the youngest in his family, with older brothers already old enough to help with heavier work. His mother would have expected him in time to follow that same path: school when possible, chores every day, and service to the collective farm, whether he wanted to or not. The rhythm of that ordinary life ended in June 1941. On the 22nd of June, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian divisions, crossed into Soviet territory. Within weeks, they overran hundreds of towns like Grin. Airplanes strafed roads and railways, tanks rolled through villages, and soldiers set fire to barns and fields. For villagers, there was no strategy, no defense line, only survival. The lucky ones managed to flee eastward. Most were caught where they stood. Sergey was 5 years old, just beginning to memorize letters at the village school, when German aircraft turned the sky above his home into a swarm of noise and smoke. Bombs fell in neat lines across farm plots, igniting haystacks and scattering livestock. His mother grabbed her children and tried to hide. The accounts we have are sparse, pieced together from later testimonies, but the result was cruelly simple. Sergey's mother and older brothers were executed by German troops, part of the routine cleansing of villages accused of harboring partisans. Sergey, separated in the chaos, survived by running into the nearby forests. He was 5 years old. His world, as he understood it, ended that day. The forests of western Russia are dense with birch, oak, and pine. In summer, the undergrowth is thick, filled with wild strawberries, raspberries, and mushrooms that have sustained villagers for centuries. Sergey wandered there alone. Think of what that means in practice. A small child, barefoot, wearing only a shirt and short trousers, without food or guidance. He slept in hollows between tree roots, sometimes curling into abandoned burrows or rotting logs for shelter. At night, the forest echoed with wolves and owls. By day, he ate whatever he could recognize: berries, mushrooms, even strips of bark. Hunger became a constant companion. He was too young to hunt, too small to defend himself, but he had one advantage. Children can hide in spaces adults cannot. For weeks, no one knows exactly how many, he lived like this. There were patrols everywhere. German soldiers combed the forests looking for partisans, and collaborators searched for those who had escaped executions. Sergey learned to recognize the sound of boots on dry leaves and the metallic clink of weapons. Silence became his only safety. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front was collapsing. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses during the first 6 months of Barbarossa. By the end of 1941, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies ceased to exist. In villages like Grin, the sense of abandonment was overwhelming. But scattered across this vast, chaotic front were units still holding together, still resisting, still regrouping. One of them was the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment, a formation created during the reorganization of shattered divisions. Their job was simple, if exhausting: screen the advancing Germans, protect the Volga region, and regroup for what everyone knew would be a long war. In late summer 1942, during one of their patrols through the forests near the Oka River, soldiers stumbled upon a child. He was thin, filthy, covered in insect bites, and nearly too weak to stand. At first, they thought he might be a partisan messenger or a decoy. But when they coaxed him out with bread, they realized they had found something else entirely: a survivor. The regiment faced a choice. Regulations dictated that orphaned children were to be transferred to civilian authorities or orphanages. But paperwork was fragile in wartime, and civilian authorities often meant a one-way trip east on overcrowded trains, if the trains were even running. More often, orphans were left to fend for themselves in cities already overflowing with refugees. The soldiers decided, quietly and unanimously, to keep Sergey with them. He was cleaned up, given a uniform shirt, and fed. One of the officers, Major Mikhail Vorobyov, effectively adopted him. Another, the regimental doctor, watched over his health, ensuring he ate properly and slept in relative safety. Sergey, in turn, adapted quickly. After weeks of silence and fear, he found himself surrounded by adults who gave him tasks, encouraged him, and even smiled at his antics. He became, at first, a mascot, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Men shared their rations with him, sewed a small cap to fit his head, and even knitted him a wool sweater against the coming winter. What strikes us most, reading the fragmentary accounts of these months, is how ordinary life reasserted itself in the most extraordinary setting. The regiment was constantly on the move, shifting positions along the western approaches to Stalingrad. Days were filled with digging trenches, hauling supplies, and trying to keep weapons in working order despite dust, mud, and shortages. Nights meant huddling in foxholes, heating tins of buckwheat porridge over tiny fires, and listening to distant artillery. Into this daily rhythm stepped a 6-year-old. He learned to march alongside them, taking 2 steps for every one of theirs. He sang songs, asked endless questions, and quickly discovered that he could make men twice his size laugh. Soldiers, hardened, led by months of combat, softened in his presence. They began teaching him to read, using army manuals and old newspapers, but Sergey also carried his nightmares with him. He sometimes woke crying in the night, remembering his mother and brothers. Major Vorobyov would comfort him, whispering promises that he was safe now. In the cold, cramped shelters of the regiment, a strange family was forming. By autumn of 1942, the regiment received orders to move toward a city on the Volga River that had already become a symbol: Stalingrad. The Germans were pushing to seize it, convinced that its fall would shatter Soviet morale. Stalin himself ordered it held at any cost. Every unit available, including the 142nd Guards, was sent into the maelstrom. For Sergey, the journey toward Stalingrad was both terrifying and exciting. He had never seen such a vast movement of men, animals, and machines. The regiment's wagons creaked under ammunition and bread, their horses thin and exhausted. Supply lines were fragile. Sometimes soldiers marched hungry. Sometimes they lived for days on a single ration of dried fish and hard bread. Through it all, Sergey trotted beside them, helping however he could. His jobs were small, carrying water, fetching firewood, delivering notes across camp. But they mattered, both to him and to the men who had taken him in. He was no longer alone in the forest. He belonged to something larger now. And yet, As they approached Stalingrad, the question grew heavier. What place could a child possibly have in a city about to become the most brutal battlefield of the Second World War? Could he remain a mascot, a lucky charm, a symbol, or would the war demand something far more of him? That is where we leave him tonight, standing at the edge of a ruined city, watching columns of smoke rise into the sky, unaware of how much more the coming months would demand. When the 142nd Guards Regiment reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942, it carried with it more than rifles and ammunition. It carried a boy who had already lost everything, and who was now slowly being folded into the daily rhythm of an army unit. This second part of our story is less about battles, and more about the ordinary routines of soldiers, routines that were exhausting, repetitive, and essential. They were also the routines that shaped Sergey Aleshkov, turning him from a half-starved orphan into a living piece of the regiment. The regiment was one of many that had been patched together after months of catastrophic losses. Soldiers came from across the Soviet Union. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, even Central Asians pulled far from home. Most were peasants or factory workers who had been conscripted and pushed into service with minimal training. By the time Sergey joined them, these men had already learned hard lessons about survival. Keep your weapon clean, keep your boots dry, and keep your rations safe. Into this world stepped a 6-year-old. His place in the regiment was unofficial, but quickly accepted. Major Mikhail Vorobyov, who had found and effectively adopted him, treated him like a son. The regiment's doctor watched over his health, making sure he ate more than just scraps, and the rank-and-file soldiers gave him small tasks that made him feel useful without putting him in danger. Daily life for the regiment was a grind. Each day began before sunrise with orders read aloud by commanders. Soldiers were assigned to dig new trenches, carry crates of ammunition, haul water from the Volga, or reinforce ruined buildings into makeshift strongpoints. Food was scarce. A thin soup of cabbage or millet, sometimes a chunk of bread, occasionally a scrap of horse meat. Soldiers stretched their rations by boiling weeds or adding sawdust to bread. Sergey shared their meals. At first he ate cautiously, not quite believing that the food was really his. But soon he became part of the queue, waiting with his tin bowl, grinning when a soldier slipped him an extra spoonful of porridge. At night, he curled up in dugouts or bunkers alongside the men, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to swallow him whole. He was too small to handle a rifle, but he quickly found ways to help. He carried water from wells, fetched firewood for stoves, and delivered small messages across camp. His size, once a disadvantage, became an asset. He could dart between men and squeeze into narrow spaces. Soldiers began to rely on him for little errands, and in return they treated him like a younger brother, or in some cases, like a son. It is tempting to imagine Sergey's time with the regiment as cheerful or playful, but the truth was harsher. He lived in the midst of constant bombardment. The Germans shelled Stalingrad relentlessly, turning factories and apartment blocks into rubble. Each explosion sent dust and debris raining down into trenches and shelters. At night, searchlights cut across the sky, illuminating flak bursts and the silhouettes of aircraft. For a child, the noise and fear must have been overwhelming. And yet, he adapted. Children are resilient, and Sergey had already endured the trauma of losing his family. Compared to that, the regiment offered stability, even if stability meant crouching in dugouts while bombs fell overhead. He learned to sleep through artillery, to wake when shouted at, to eat quickly when food was available. The soldiers around him softened in ways that would have surprised their families back home. These were men who had spent months killing and watching friends die, but in Sergey's presence they rediscovered patience. They taught him to read using scraps of newspaper and old training manuals. They showed him how to shine boots, how to fold a blanket, how to salute properly. One soldier knitted him a sweater from leftover wool, carefully shaping it to his tiny size. At the same time, Sergey absorbed their culture. He listened to their songs, melancholy folk tunes and upbeat marching chants. He watched how they cooked in mess tins, how they cleaned their rifles with strips of cloth, how they argued over politics or football teams, even in the middle of a war zone. For him, this became a new version of family life, stitched together out of necessity and affection. The regiment itself was under constant strain. Supplies were limited, and the Volga was often the only lifeline. Barges carried ammunition and food across under constant attack from German aircraft. Soldiers sometimes went days without bread. Frost crept into boots at night. Vermin gnawed at stored grain. Disease lurked in every trench, and the medical staff, overworked and undersupplied, could do little more than bandage wounds and ration out quinine or iodine. Sergey saw all of this. He watched men fall ill. He heard the coughs that grew worse in the damp shelters, and he watched comrades buried quickly in shallow graves. For a 6-year-old, these were sights no child should see. But they became part of his daily world, absorbed as naturally as chores or lessons. The soldiers gave him small ceremonial roles too. During roll calls, he sometimes stood with them, his tiny figure barely reaching a man's belt. He marched in imitation of the others, his 2 quick steps for every one of theirs earning chuckles from the ranks. He insisted on carrying a wooden stick shaped like a rifle, and the men indulged him. In an environment where morale was fragile, Sergey's presence was a reminder of innocence, of why they endured. But innocence could not entirely shield him from the horrors. At night, he sometimes woke crying, calling for his mother. Major Vorobyov comforted him, reminding him that he was safe now. The regiment became his surrogate family, but the wounds of loss never entirely healed. Even as he laughed with soldiers or darted about camp, those shadows followed him. By autumn, as the regiment settled into its defensive positions within the city itself, Sergey's role expanded. He became a messenger within the unit. Radios were scarce, lines easily cut by bombardment, and couriers were essential. His small size and quickness made him useful for short runs between positions. It was dangerous, but for Sergey it felt like a way to belong, to contribute like the men he admired. These errands were rarely glamorous. They involved carrying scraps of paper from one dugout to another, or shouting a command across a street when shells forced soldiers underground. But each run carried risk. A single stray bullet, a fragment of shrapnel, and the boy would have joined the countless others buried beneath the ruins. Daily life inside the regiment followed patterns that blurred together. Wake to shelling, dig trenches, carry supplies, eat quickly, endure bombardment, sleep in bursts. For Sergey, those patterns became normal. He played when he could, with makeshift toys fashioned out of shell casings or scraps of wood. He asked endless questions about weapons and tactics. He sang songs with the men to drown out fear. But in quieter moments, he must have wondered, was this truly his new life? Would he ever return to a world of classrooms and games, or was he destined to remain in the ruins, a child soldier in all but name? That question hovered as the regiment prepared for the hardest months of the battle. The Germans were tightening their grip, the Soviets were straining every resource to resist, and the city was becoming a meat grinder. Sergey had found a new family among the soldiers, but what would it demand of him next? By the time autumn of 1942 settled over Stalingrad, Sergey was no longer just a mascot. The city had become a furnace of rubble, dust, and fire, and everyone inside its broken streets was expected to contribute something. For the men of the 142nd Guards Regiment, that meant long days of digging, waiting, and sudden bursts of desperate fighting. For Sergey, it meant carrying messages and slipping through spaces where grown men could not go. His story in Stalingrad was not about commanding armies, but about errands that made survival possible. The German assault intensified as September turned to October. Factories, oil tanks, apartment blocks, everything was bombed and reduced to jagged walls and heaps of bricks. The regiment's sector was a factory complex, one of many fortified strongpoints along the Volga. Radios often failed, either smashed by shell fire or silenced to avoid detection. Communication depended on runners. Sergey became one of them. His first assignment was simple: carry a folded scrap of paper from one bunker to another, only 100 meters apart. The problem was that the street between them was under sniper fire. A grown man would have been an obvious target. A boy darting across, small, fast, hard to spot, had a better chance. With encouragement from Major Vorobyov, Sergey ran. He zigzagged across the street, heart pounding, explosions rattling his bones. Somehow he made it. The message warned of a German flanking maneuver. Acting on that information, the regiment repositioned just in time to hold their ground. That single run gave Sergey a reputation. Soldiers patted his head, called him a hero, and gave him extra rations. But it also meant he would be asked again and again to carry messages. His errands were not daily, but they were constant enough to shape his world. Sometimes he carried notes, sometimes whispered messages he memorized. He ran to move cautiously, hugging walls, darting between rubble, crawling through holes blasted in masonry. His small size became an advantage. Places that stopped a man's shoulders or hips were easy for him to squeeze through. There were close calls. Once, a sniper spotted him. Bullets kicked up dirt at his heels as he scrambled into a crater, mud coating his clothes and hair. He lay trembling, certain it was the end. The sniper shifted attention elsewhere, and Sergey emerged, shaken, but determined to finish his task. Another time, he froze in the ruins of a stairwell as German voices echoed nearby. He pressed himself into a crack in the wall, barely breathing until they passed. The men of the regiment joked that he was lucky, that he carried charm with him. But luck was only part of it. He was careful, resourceful, and motivated by something deeper than orders. The memory of his mother and brothers, lost in his village. He did not want their deaths to be meaningless. Beyond his runs, Sergey lived as the soldiers lived. They rationed bread into thin slices, boiled millet into porridge when supplies allowed, and brewed weak tea from leaves steeped again and again. Sometimes he helped gather splinters of wood to fuel small stoves. He learned how to patch uniforms with thread pulled from old socks. He sat with soldiers cleaning rifles, fascinated by the careful oiling and assembly. The daily grind of war became his schooling. Instead of arithmetic problems, he learned the weight of ammunition crates. Instead of handwriting exercises, he memorized codes and signals. Instead of playground games, he played hide-and-seek with death in the ruins. The city itself shaped him too. Stalingrad in autumn was a place of endless smoke. Fires smoldered constantly, filling the air with acrid haze. Dust coated lips and teeth. The Volga River, once broad and calm, was scarred with beise, burning barges and wrecked ferries. At night the horizon glowed red, and the ground trembled with bombardment. Sergey grew used to the constant vibration of war. In November, conditions worsened. Cold seeped in as temperatures dropped below freezing. The regiment huddled in bunkers, layering whatever clothing they could find. Sergey wore 2 sweaters, one knitted for him by a soldier, another scavenged from a ruined house. His boots were too large, stuffed with rags. At night, he curled close to Major Vorobyov for warmth. Food dwindled further. Soldiers cut rations to bare minimums. Sometimes they boiled leather for soup. Sometimes they shared a single crust of bread among 3 men. Sergey was never left out. Soldiers gave him part of their own portions, believing he brought luck. In return, he worked tirelessly at his little tasks, proud to contribute. The cold also brought new dangers. Fires used for warmth drew sniper fire. Frostbite threatened fingers and toes, weapons jammed with frozen oil. And yet, the regiment endured. They sang songs to keep spirits alive, wrote letters to families they might never see again, and told stories in the dark to drown out fear. Sergey listened to every word, absorbing their sorrows and their resilience. One incident defined this period: the bunker entrapment. In late November, German forces launched a massive assault on the factory complex. Sergey, Major Vorobyov, and a group of soldiers were trapped inside a command bunker. Tanks rumbled outside, artillery shook the walls, and supplies ran low. The radio failed. It seemed only a matter of time before the Germans overran them. That was when Sergey spotted something the adults had overlooked: a narrow air vent. Too small for a grown man, but just wide enough for a thin child. He volunteered immediately. Vorobyov tried to refuse, but Sergey insisted. If he did not go, no one would. The men gave him a note describing their position and situation. Sergey squeezed into the vent and crawled into darkness. It was a terrifying journey. Rats scurried past, dust choked his lungs, and the tunnel narrowed so tightly he feared becoming stuck. But he pressed on. Emerging into the ruins, he found himself behind German lines. Using every bit of cunning he had learned, he crept through the battlefield, dodging patrols, hiding behind wreckage, even lying motionless among corpses until soldiers passed. Somehow, he reached a Soviet position. The message he carried summoned reinforcements. Hours later, Soviet forces broke through and rescued the trapped regiment. That act became legend within the unit. Soldiers spoke of the boy who had crawled through death itself to save them. For Sergey, it was simply another task, another way to belong. By December, word of his bravery spread beyond the regiment. Soviet commanders took note. Plans for a medal began to circulate. But for Sergey, daily life remained the same: fetching water, carrying messages, enduring bombardments. He was still a child, still small, still hungry and tired. The medal, if it came, would not change the fact that tomorrow he would rise again in the ruins, ready to run where others could not. These months at Stalingrad reshaped him. He had entered the city as a mascot, uncertain of his place. He now stood as a messenger, a survivor, and a comrade. He had found purpose among men twice, even 3 times his age. But war was not finished with him. As winter deepened and the German Sixth Army began to falter, the Soviets prepared for their counterstroke. The city's final chapter was approaching, and in that chapter the smallest soldier would again be asked to do more than anyone thought possible. What more could the war demand of him? By the end of 1942, Stalingrad was a frozen ruin. The Volga had iced over, cutting supply lines to a trickle, and the German Sixth Army was trapped inside the tightening Soviet encirclement. For the 142nd Guards Regiment, survival remained uncertain. They had endured months of bombardment, hunger, and exhaustion, and in their midst stood a 6-year-old boy who had already done more than anyone could have expected. This final part of Sergey's wartime story brings us through his recognition, the last phase of the battle, and the quieter years that followed. News of Sergey's bravery reached higher levels of command. Reports described the boy who carried messages under fire, who crawled through vents to save a trapped company, who lifted morale simply by surviving among them. In December 1942, Soviet commanders decided to honor him formally. The award ceremony was almost surreal. Soldiers who had seen the worst horrors of war gathered in a ruined courtyard as their smallest comrade was presented with the Medal for Battle Merit. The medal itself nearly covered his chest, hanging awkwardly on his oversized tunic. General Rodimtsev of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, a man hardened by months of brutal combat, bent down to pin the award. For once, the ceremony was less about propaganda and more about acknowledging something everyone felt: that this boy, despite his age, had been one of them. Accounts recall that when asked to say a few words, Sergey simply asked for more chocolate. The soldiers laughed, but the mood shifted when a journalist asked him why he risked his life. His reply was quiet: "Because they killed my mother and my brothers." For a moment, even battle-scarred men were silenced. The medal did not remove him from the front. Arguments raged. Some officers wanted him sent away for safety and propaganda. Others insisted he belonged with the regiment. Sergey himself refused to leave. In his mind, he was already a soldier. He carried a wooden training rifle proudly, insisting it made him ready for the day he could handle a real one. The winter of 1942-43 was bitter. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Frostbite was constant. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet to replace worn boots. Fires were dangerous, drawing enemy attention, but without them, men froze in dugouts. Food was scarcer than ever. Rations often dwindled to a crust of bread per day. Yet morale in the regiment shifted. The encirclement of German forces gave hope that the end might be in sight. Sergey shared in these rhythms. He shivered with the men in shelters, chewed hard bread until his jaw ached, and huddled close to Major Vorobyov for warmth. At night, he still asked questions, sometimes about weapons, sometimes about home, sometimes simply, "Will it end soon?" No one could answer with certainty. One of the strangest moments came in January 1943, during an assault on a fortified German position. The stronghold happened to be a former kindergarten. The irony was not lost on anyone. For Sergey, it was both haunting and familiar. He insisted he knew the building, that there was a small tunnel once used by teachers. Skeptical but desperate, commanders allowed him to guide a team through it. The passage was cramped and filthy, but it led directly inside. The surprise infiltration helped Soviet forces capture the position. In the chaos, Sergey once again proved his courage, darting between soldiers, distracting enemies, and even hurling objects with surprising accuracy. When the battle was over, he stood in the ruined playground, staring at twisted swings and shattered walls. Childhood itself seemed to lie in ruins around him. On February 2, 1943, the German Sixth Army finally surrendered. Stalingrad was a wasteland of corpses, rubble, and silence, but it was also the site of a turning point in the war. For the men of the 142nd, the end brought exhaustion and disbelief. For Sergey, it was both relief and confusion. He had survived the greatest battle of the war, but what came next? The regiment celebrated in small ways. Cups of hot tea, rare sweets, songs sung around stoves. Soldiers lifted Sergey onto their shoulders, calling him their littlest hero. Journalists photographed him, stories circulated, and his legend began to grow. Yet behind the cheer was the reality that the boy was only 6, already carrying the weight of loss and violence most men could not bear. After Stalingrad, Major Vorobyov kept his promise. Sergey was sent to a Suvorov military school, an institution designed to educate and discipline war orphans. There he experienced, for the first time in years, something close to a normal childhood. He wore a proper uniform, attended classes, and slept in a bed rather than a bunker. But even at school, his reputation followed him. Teachers knew of his mettle, classmates whispered about his survival at Stalingrad, and sometimes Sergey himself reminded them, with a grin, that he had seen things they could hardly imagine. He grew into adolescence carrying both the scars and the pride of his past. Teachers reported that he joked about his major in survival and corrected history lessons when they did not match his own memories. For him, school was both strange and welcome. There were no artillery shells, but the discipline and regimentation felt familiar. As an adult, Sergey remained tied to the military. He graduated, served, and eventually lived to see decades of peace. He died in 1990 at the age of 54, long after the war that defined his childhood had ended. His last word, yes, according to accounts, were a wry remark. "Well, I outlived Hitler by quite a margin, didn't I?" Looking back, Sergey Aleshkov's story is almost unbelievable. A child who should have been in classrooms or playgrounds instead carried messages under sniper fire, crawled through vents to save soldiers, and stood among hardened veterans as one of their own. His life raises questions that cannot be fully answered. How much of his courage was necessity? How much was resilience? and how much was the desperate determination of a boy who had lost everything. What we know is that he endured, that he gave hope to those around him, and that his presence in Stalingrad is remembered even today. In the ruins of a city where entire armies broke, a 6-year-old boy became a soldier. And when we think about the hidden costs of war, we might ask ourselves, how many other children, unnamed, forgotten, were also pressed into roles they should never have known? The story of Sergey Aleshkov reminds us how the war pulled even the youngest into its orbit. But while one small boy was running messages through rubble, thousands of men and women far from the front lines were fighting a quieter, slower battle. One measured in timetables, track repairs, and freezing nights beside locomotives. Their work rarely made headlines, yet without them, the Red Army would have withered. Tonight, we turn to the Soviet railway workers, the hidden lifeline of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's railway system was vast even before the war. Stretching across forests, rivers, and steppes, it linked Moscow to Leningrad, to Stalingrad, to the oil fields of the Caucasus, and to the factories of the Urals. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the system became both a prize and a target. German forces bombed bridges and stations, tore up rails, and captured entire stretches of track. Yet the Soviet command knew that if trains could keep running, armies could keep fighting. Railway workers, engineers, conductors, track layers, mechanics were mobilized almost as quickly as soldiers. Some were drafted into military railway battalions. Others remained civilians, but lived in conditions hardly different from the front. Their daily routines were unglamorous but relentless, checking rails for damage, hammering spikes into frozen ties, clearing snowdrifts, repairing locomotives with parts scavenged from wrecks. A shift often began before dawn. Men and women stumbled out of barracks or makeshift huts, their breath hanging in the cold, tools slung over their shoulders. The first task was always inspection, walking miles of track to look for cracks or sabotage. Mines and explosives were common. German planes sometimes strafed workers directly, turning routine patrols into sudden scrambles for cover. Meals were sparse. A tin of kasha, porridge made from millet or buck, wheat, might serve as both breakfast and lunch. Tea was brewed weekly, leaves reused until they were nearly colorless. Bread was precious, often stretched with sawdust or potato flour. Workers ate quickly, standing beside tracks or crouched in ditches before returning to the job. Locomotive crews faced their own trials. Steam engines were temperamental in the best of times. In wartime, they were patched together from whatever parts remained. Boiler leaks were sealed with rags, valves replaced with improvised fittings, and lubricants mixed from animal fat when oil ran out. Drivers and firemen worked in deafening heat, shoveling coal, or when coal was scarce, wood, peat, even dried dung, into roaring furnaces. The contrast was brutal. Inside the cab, heat and sweat. Outside, a cutting wind that froze water in seconds. Men staggered down from shifts soaked through, their clothes stiffening as moisture turned to ice. Yet trains had to keep moving. Ammunition, food, reinforcements. Everything the army needed traveled by rail. A delayed train might mean an encircled regiment left without supplies, or a factory starved of fuel. The winter of 1941-42 was especially harsh. Snow piled meters high, blocking tracks, burying switches, freezing points solid. Clearing crews worked with shovels, axes, and picks, hacking at drifts hour after hour. When locomotives were fitted with crude snowplows, crews rode on open platforms, blasted by wind and ice until their faces were raw. Frostbite was constant. Workers wrapped rags around hands and feet, changed shifts quickly to avoid collapse, and sometimes lit fires directly on rails to loosen frozen joints. Despite all this, timetables were kept with astonishing discipline. Orders from Moscow demanded punctuality measured in minutes, even during bombardments. Workers joked grimly that trains had to run on time, even if the passengers were shong. Ells and the stations were rubble. Life along the tracks was monotonous and exhausting, but it carried its own culture. Families often lived in small railway settlements, clusters of wooden barracks beside depots. Children helped gather firewood. Women cooked communal meals from shared rations, and old men repaired tools. When air raids came, families and workers alike crammed into dugouts beside the tracks. Railway workers developed rituals to endure. They sang folk songs to keep rhythm while hammering spikes. They carved wooden charms to hang in cabs for luck. They told stories of trains that had outrun bombers, or of engineers who drove straight through artillery fire without slowing. In these tales, survival became part of the job description. The dangers were constant. Bombing raids could strike at any time, turning stations into infernos. Mines planted on tracks could derail entire trains. Saboteurs loosened bolts, tore out sleepers, or poured sand into bearings. Workers learned to spot tiny irregularities, an oddly placed stone, a glint of wire in the grass that might signal disaster. Many paid with their lives when they guessed wrong, yet replacements were always found. Young women stepped into roles once held by men. Teenage boys learned to swing hammers or fire engines. The system absorbed losses and kept running. Trains continued to arrive, soldiers continued to move east and west, and supplies continued to reach factories. Behind the statistics lay personal sacrifice. Workers often labored 12 or 14-hour shifts, slept in unheated huts, and ate rations barely sufficient for survival. Illness spread quickly in crowded quarters. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed many lives. Still, absences were rare. To miss a shift was to risk derailing the war effort itself. In this way, the railway became a second front, quieter than Stalingrad, but no less essential. For every bullet fee arrayed at the front, coal had been shoveled, rails had been hammered, and switches had been cleared somewhere in the vast Soviet interior. As autumn turned to winter again in 1942, the question for these workers was simple yet relentless. How long could they keep trains moving under such conditions? Could improvisation and endurance outlast the constant pressure of sabotage, bombing, and brutal weather? That uncertainty hung over every mile of track, every rattling carriage, every exhausted crew. And it is where we leave them tonight, huddled in snowdrifts, lanterns flickering, waiting for the next train to come rumbling out of the dark. The trains kept moving, but not without cost. By 1942, the German Air Force understood that every Soviet rifle, shell, and loaf of bread depended on the railway network. Bombers prowled overhead, targeting bridges, junctions, and stations with relentless precision. For railway workers, this meant their already punishing routines took place under the constant threat of attack. Tonight, we trace the dull but dangerous rhythm of life on the tracks, when every hammer strike might be interrupted by the drone of engines in the sky. Railway stations became prime targets. Bombing raids usually came at night, when visibility was poor and the sudden roar of aircraft engines meant only seconds to find shelter. Workers slept in their clothes, boots at their bedside, ready to run at the first alarm. Dugouts and trenches lined station yards, little more than shallow pits roofed with timbers. Families huddled together inside while bombs shook the ground. After each raid, survivors emerged to find platforms cratered, rails twisted, and locomotives overturned. Repairs began immediately. Crews cleared debris with bare hands, hammered rails back into alignment, and scavenged usable parts from wreckage. They worked in darkness, guided by lanterns or the dim light of fires still smoldering in freight cars. The smell of burning coal, scorched wood, and hot metal filled the air. By dawn, trains were moving again, patched together from whatever could be salvaged. The monotony of repair defined these months. A rail torn up by bombing was replaced, only to be destroyed again a week later. A bridge rebuilt in freezing rain might collapse under the next artillery barrage. Workers grew accustomed to repeating the same tasks endlessly, driving spikes, straightening bent rails, clearing rubble. Days blurred into weeks, each one marked by the sound of hammers, the grind of wheels, the distant thun. Au revoir. For many, this endless cycle was demoralizing, yet pride persisted. A repaired track meant soldiers at the front would eat. A cleared junction meant factories in the Urals would receive coal. Each task, however repetitive, was woven into the survival of the nation. Locomotive crews also lived under bombardment. German aircraft targeted moving trains, especially those carrying troops or fuel. Pilots swooped low, machine guns raking carriages, bombs striking locomotives. Engineers responded by pushing engines to maximum speed, driving through smoke and explosions with little regard for safety. Some trains derailed under the strain. Others emerged scorched but intact. Crews spoke of hearing bullets ping off boilers or of leaning out to see flames licking along carriages. Inside the cab, conditions were already brutal. Firemen shoveled coal non-stop, faces streaked with sweat and soot. Drivers squinted through grime-smeared windows, hands raw from gripping levers. Now they did so while watching the skies, bracing for the next attack. A single mistake, a missed signal, an overheated boiler, could mean catastrophe. Life between raids carried its own quiet routines. Workers checked bolts, greased bearings, and measured rail gaps with calloused fingers. They slept in bunks stacked 3 high inside wooden huts, air thick with smoke from stoves. Quarters smelled of damp wool, coal dust, and boiled cabbage. Privacy was non-existent. Men and women shared close quarters, their lives reduced to shifts, meals, and exhaustion. Rations were no better than those at the front. Bread stretched with potato flour, thin cabbage soup, sometimes dried fish. When supplies ran low, workers scavenged berries in summer or boiled pine needles for vitamin C in winter. Tea was a luxury, brewed from the same leaves for days. Alcohol, when available, was rationed as much for morale as for warmth. Despite hardships, railway communities found ways to preserve ordinary life. Women sewed patches onto uniforms by lantern light. Children played beside tracks, building toy trains from scraps of wood. Older men tended small gardens behind huts, coaxing potatoes and onions from poor soil. On rare evenings without raids, workers gathered to sing folk songs, their voices carrying over the clang of metal. These moments of routine and tradition gave a sense of continuity, even as war threatened to erase everything familiar. The dangers never ceased. Sabotage was a constant threat. Partisan groups sometimes fought on the same lines workers were repairing, and infiltrators occasionally loosened bolts or placed mines on tracks. Inspectors walked miles each day, scanning for signs of tampering, disturbed earth, odd shadows, unusual marks on sleepers. Many lost their lives when they missed a trap. Others saved trains at the last moment, waving flags frantically to halt an oncoming locomotive before it struck disaster. Workers developed superstitions to cope. Some carried charms carved from bits of rail. Others avoided stepping on certain sleepers believed unlucky. Before major repairs, crews sometimes paused for a shared moment of silence, a habit born not of religion, but of respect for those lost before them. Fatigue became the greatest enemy. Shifts often stretched to 14 or 16 hours, especially after raids. Men nodded off while swinging hammers. Women collapsed beside track beds, only to rise and continue minutes later. Accidents multiplied. Fingers crushed under sleepers, feet severed by wheels, backs broken under loads of rails. Medical care was minimal. A quick bandage, a shot of vodka for pain, and workers returned to duty if they could stand. And yet, the trains moved. Even as bridges collapsed and stations burned, schedules were met. Soldiers at the front received food and ammunition. Evacuees from besieged cities were carried east. Factories churned out tanks and aircraft because coal and steel arrived on time. Railway workers rarely saw battlefields, but their lives were consumed by a war just as deadly. By late 1942, the question was not whether they could endure another bombardment. Everyone assumed the raids would come again. But how long human bodies and minds could sustain the endless grind? Could men and women living on meager rations, sleeping in smoke-filled huts, and laboring under constant threat continue to hold the railways together? That unanswered question lingered in every station yard and repair camp as workers tightened bolts and wiped soot from their faces, listening for the next engine in the sky. By the end of 1942, winter had clamped down across the Soviet Union. Snow buried tracks in white silence, while winds howled over steppe and forest. For railway workers, already battered by raids and fatigue, the season brought a new layer of hardship. Steel rails grew brittle, switches froze solid, and locomotives stalled in the cold. Yet trains had to keep moving. Tonight, we linger with them through the winter of 1942-43, when improvisation became as vital as endurance. Snow removal was the first battle. Drifts covered lines in hours, erasing tracks as if they had never existed. Clearing crews armed with shovels, axes, and crude plows worked around the clock. A line might be dug out one day, only to vanish again the next. Where snowplows could not reach, workers used fire. They built bonfires directly on rails to thaw frozen joints, then hammered bolts back into place while embers glowed around their boots. The work was exhausting. Men swung picks until their arms went numb. Women heaved shovelfuls of ice into piles taller than themselves. Lanterns flickered in the night as crews chipped at switches welded shut by frost. Every cleared kilometre was a small victory, often paid for with frostbite and exhaustion. Coal shortages deepened the crisis. Mines strained to meet demand, yet locomotives devoured fuel faster than it could be delivered. Trains often had to burn wood, peat, or even dried dung in place of coal. Entire forests near rail lines were stripped bare, felled trees hacked into logs and fed into boilers. The heat was weaker, efficiency poor, and engines struggled to maintain pressure. Firemen sweated in cabs filled with smoke, eyes stinging, lungs burning from the acrid fumes. Some crews grew inventive. They mixed coal dust with clay to form crude briquettes. They scavenged tar barrels from wrecked depots and broke them apart for fuel. Anything combust. Ibel found its way into fireboxes. Stories circulated of locomotives powered by a patchwork of pine logs, old tires, even bundles of straw soaked in kerosene. The cold affected every part of the system. Water froze in tenders, requiring constant thawing. Oil congealed, bearings seized, and wheels cracked from sudden temperature shifts. Workers heated metal with torches, poured boiling water onto frozen parts, and wrapped engines in canvas to keep heat trapped. Trains sometimes stood motionless for hours until enough warmth returned to coax them forward. Crews themselves became half-frozen extensions of their machines. They wrapped rags around hands, faces, and feet, layering whatever scraps of cloth they could find. Breath crystallized instantly, beards stiff with ice. Shifts were shortened when possible, but many endured 12 hours in cabs open to the wind. Frostbite blackened fingers. Some men lost toes, yet returned to duty with crude bandages. The alternative was leaving trains idle, and that was unthinkable. Along the tracks, settlements braced for the same cold. Families lived in drafty wooden huts, windows stuffed with rags, stoves burning weakly with whatever fuel could be found. Meals shrank to thin soups of cabbage or beets, stretched with potato peelings. Children gathered pine cones to be used as kindling. Women sewed quilts from rags, patched boots again and again, and prayed that the next train would bring flour or coal. For railway workers, family life blurred into the job. Husbands and wives often labored together on clearing crews. Children helped carry tools or gather firewood. Night after night, families listened to the same distant rumble of trains, a reassurance that the lifeline still held. Despite hardships, timetables remained strict. Moscow demanded punctuality even in blizzards. A train that arrived late risked leaving soldiers without ammunition or factories without steel. Workers cursed schedules as unrealistic, yet they complied. Crews dug, shoveled, and hammered until the line was cleared, then drove trains through snowstorms with lamps dimmed to hide from aircraft. Accidents multiplied. Engines derailed on icy curves, cars jackknifed in blizzards, bridges collapsed under sudden loads. Rescue crews braved storms to re-rail locomotives, often working blind in whiteouts. Bodies sometimes froze in place before they could be carried away. Still, replacements arrived, wrecks were cleared, and traffic resumed. The winter was not only physical, but psychological. The endless whiteness, the sameness of days, the repetition of repairs wore men and women down. Depression spread quietly. Some muttered that the snow would never melt, that the war itself might never end. Others clung to small rituals, a shared song while clearing drifts, a carved wooden token carried in a pocket, a letter read aloud in a hut after a long shift. These fragments of normalcy kept despair at bay. Yet even in the worst cold, the system functioned. Trains carried food to Leningrad, still under siege. Trains carried coal to the Urals, where tanks rolled off assembly lines. Trains carried reinforcements towards Stalingrad, where the encirclement of the German Sixth Army was tightening. Each successful journey was invisible to those who benefited, but railway workers knew the price. Every bullet fired, every loaf baked, every tank built depended on their stubborn effort against snow and frost. By early 1943, as days slowly lengthened and snow began to soften, workers faced a new question. Would spring bring relief, or only new disasters? Flooded tracks, washed-out bridges, and renew it. Air raids. Winter had tested their endurance. The thaw would test their ability to adapt once more. And so, we leave them here, at the edge of a new season. Weary, frostbitten, soot-streaked, yet still keeping trains moving through a land of fire and ice. The winter of 1942-43 finally gave way to spring. Snow melted into mud, rivers swelled, and railway workers faced a new set of challenges. Washed-out bridges, flooded embankments, and tracks sinking into sodden ground. Yet the system endured. By then, the Red Army had secured its decisive victory at Stalingrad, a triumph made possible in no small part by the quiet labor of men and women on the rails. Tonight, we bring their story to a close, reflecting on how their hidden work shaped the course of the Eastern Front and left a legacy long after the war. The immediate impact of the railway effort was clear. The ability to deliver reinforcements and supplies across thousands of kilometers allowed the Soviet Union to recover from early disasters. Factories in the Urals and Siberia, relocated from threatened western regions, received steady shipments of coal, ore, and machinery. Food traveled from rural hinterlands to starving cities. Weapons moved in the other direction, carried to the front where battles raged. Without this flow, armies would have withered, and victories like Stalingrad would have been impossible. Yet what is striking is not only the scale, but the constancy. Despite bombings, sabotage, and exhaustion, trains ran almost without interruption. Schedules demanded by Moscow were often met within minutes, even under bombardment. Workers sacrificed rest, health, and sometimes their lives to keep rails open. Their reward was not medals or parades, but the knowledge that each train meant survival for someone else. In the long term, the war transformed the railway workforce itself. Before 1941, the industry had been dominated by men. By 1943, women made up a large share of track crews, engine staff, and depot workers. Teenagers too young for the army swung hammers beside their elders. After the war, many returned home, but others remained, having proven themselves indispensable. The Soviet Union's post-war railway system bore the imprint of this wartime inclusivity, though official recognition lagged behind reality. Technological improvisations also left a mark. Wartime shortages forced crews to develop creative solutions, burning wood in locomotives, mixing fuels, patching engines with scavenged parts. These practices were remembered long after peace returned, shaping a culture of ingenuity among railway staff. The ability to make do with limited resources became a point of pride, a skill passed on to younger generations. Communities along the tracks bore scars too. Villages and settlements near depots were bombed repeatedly, their huts rebuilt from charred timbers. Cemeteries grew with the graves of workers killed in raids or accidents. Families carried memories of winters spent in unheated huts, of nights when bombs fell without warning, of mornings spent clearing rubble before breakfast. These memories lingered, sometimes unspoken, shaping the identity of railway families for decades. At the same time, there was quiet pride. Workers told their children, "We kept the trains running." In Soviet culture, railways became a symbol of endurance. Songs celebrated the Iron Road. Poems praised the heroes of the rails, and monuments were erected in station squares. For those who had lived through it, the pride was tempered by grief. But it was real. The strategic legacy was undeniable. Historians later argued that logistics, more than tactics or technology, decided the war in the East. The ability to move entire armies, to shift factories thousands of kilometers, to sustain sieges and counter-offensives, all depended on the railways. German commanders underestimated this resilience, believing that bombing and sabotage would cripple the system. Instead, it bent, but did not break. In this sense, railway workers were combatants in all but name. They wore civilian clothes, wielded hammers instead of rifles, yet their labor was as decisive as any battle. Without them, the Red Army could not have fought, factories could not have built, and cities could not have endured. Their war was waged not in trenches, but in shifts measured by timetables and the rumble of wheels. After 1945, recognition came slowly. Soldiers were decorated in parades. Workers often returned to obscurity. Some received medals for valiant labor in the Great Patriotic War, but many more were simply expected to resume duties in peacetime. Only decades later did memoirs and local histories begin to capture their sacrifices. In some towns, small museums displayed shovels, lanterns, and uniforms from the era, reminders of the winter nights when every tool was precious. For surviving workers, memories were mixed. They spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and fear, but also of comradeship and shared purpose. They remembered the sound of hammers echoing through snowstorms, the glow of lanterns on frozen tracks, the moment when a repaired train rumbled past and everyone cheered despite their numb hands. These small victories sustained them then and remained bright in memory afterward. Today, when we think of the Eastern Front, we picture vast battles, sweeping offensives, and ruined cities. But behind every image lay the unseen labor of railway workers. Their story is one of repetition, of dull but vital tasks, shoveling snow, hammering spikes, patching boilers, that together form the backbone of a war effort. It is a reminder that victory is not only forged in combat, but also in persistence. As the war receded into history, trains continued to roll across the Soviet Union, carrying passengers and freight through forests and steppes. Many of the tracks had been laid, repaired, and defended, said by those wartime workers. Each whistle and clatter was, in a sense, an echo of their endurance. And so we close this second story with reflection. The men and women of the Soviet railways did not fight with rifles, but they fought nonetheless. They fought the cold, the bombs, the fatigue, and above all the silence that comes when a train does not arrive. They fought so that others could fight on battlefields far away. Their legacy is not just in history books, but in the simple fact that trains still run across those same tracks today. From the railways of the Soviet Union, we now shift westward, across snowbound plains and bombed-out cities, to the coalfields of Britain. Here, another war was being fought, not with rifles or tanks, but with picks, shovels, and sweat in the dark. Coal powered the furnaces of factories, the boilers of ships, and the stoves of households. Without it, no aircraft could fly, no warship could sail, no home could stay warm. Tonight, we begin the story of the British miners of World War II, the hidden army that labored beneath the earth while bombs fell above. When the war began in 1939, Britain already depended heavily on coal. More than 90% of the country's energy came from it. Railways ran on coal-fired steam. Electricity plants consumed it, and every household stove required it for cooking and heating. The government knew that securing coal supplies was as critical as securing weapons or food. For miners, this meant their labor, already grueling, became a matter of national survival. The life of a miner was defined by routine. Each day began early, often before dawn. Men woke in rows of terraced houses clustered near pits, ate breakfasts of porridge or bread spread with dripping, and walked to collieries under grey skies. Lamps were checked, boots laced, helmets adjusted. Then came the descent. Elevators carrying dozens at a time, deep into shafts where air grew damp, warm and heavy with dust. The transition from cold morning air to subterranean darkness was one miners knew by heart. Once underground, work unfolded in long hours of monotony punctuated by bursts of danger. Miners wielded picks against seams, set charges of explosives, loaded coal into carts. The noise of machinery, the clatter of falling rock, and the scrape of shovels blended into a rhythm that numbed the senses. Coal dust clung to skin and clothes, filling lungs despite damp cloths tied over their mouths. Water seeped from ceilings, turning floors into slick mud. Rats prowled in shadows, feeding on scraps. Meals were taken in snatches, bread pulled from tin boxes, cheese wrapped in cloth, tea from battered flasks. Lanterns provided weak light, casting long shadows on rock walls. Conversation revolved around shifts, wages, and local gossip. Above all was the sense of repetition. Day after day, miners returned to the same shafts, the same seams, the same toil. During the Blitz, the contrast between above-ground and underground life sharpened. While cities like London and Coventry burned under bombs, miners continued their shifts below. Explosions could sometimes be felt as distant vibrations, but the real threat underground was collapse, gas, or flood. Families of miners listened to air raid sirens above while waiting for husbands or fathers to return from pits below. The work never stopped, because coal could not be spared. The government recognized this dependence by declaring mining an essential industry. Men were exempted from military service if they worked in pits. Later, when conscription drained too many miners, the government introduced the Bevin Boys scheme. Young men chosen by lottery to serve not in uniform, but underground. Many resented the assignment at first, but they soon learned that wielding a shovel in darkness could be as vital to the war as wielding a rifle in France. Conditions underground reflected the strains of war. Equipment wore out faster than it could be replaced. Ventilation systems broke down, lamps flickered, and rails for coal carts bent under strain. With metal diverted to weapons production, repairs were patched together with whatever was available. Safety suffered. Roof falls increased, and explosions of gas claimed lives. Still, quotas had to be met. Inspectors measured tons extracted, and pressure from both government. And managers left little room for hesitation. Above ground, miners' families bore hardships of rationing. Meat, sugar, and fats were limited, and coal itself, despite its abundance underground, was rationed for household use. Women queued at shops for hours, eking out meals from meager supplies. Many also worked, either in munitions factories or as clerks in local offices. Children scavenged wood or scraps of coal near rail sidings to help heat homes. The community of miners developed its own resilience. Trade union halls hosted meetings where grievances were voiced and solidarity affirmed. Chapels provided not only worship, but also gathering spaces for music and education. Football clubs and brass bands, long part of mining culture, continued despite the war, offering rare moments of joy. Even in blackouts, songs rose from terraces, voices carrying over streets, darkened by regulations. Miners' pride rested in the knowledge that their labor was indispensable. They often joked that without coal, Churchill himself would be left speechless in the cold. Yet this pride was tempered by fatigue. Shifts stretched longer, wages did not always keep pace, and injuries mounted. Some men spoke bitterly of being the army underground, called heroes when convenient, forgotten when disputes arose. By 1941 and 1942, strikes broke out in some pits. Workers demanded better pay, safety measures and recognition. These strikes were controversial, denounced by newspapers as unpatriotic. Yet they revealed the tension between the nation's dependence on miners and the poor conditions under which they labored. The government negotiated, sometimes grudgingly, aware that without coal, the war effort itself would falter. Still, beneath these disputes lay the steady rhythm of mining life. Shifts began and ended. Carts rattled up shafts, chimneys poured smoke over valleys. Families adapted, children grew, seasons turned. For many miners, the war years were less a story of dramatic events than of unending repetition. The same tunnels, the same dust, the same exhaustion, day after day. And yet, questions lingered. How long could miners sustain this pace without breaking down? Could young Bevin boys, untrained and unwilling, adapt to the relentless grind underground? And when the war ended, would miners be remembered as heroes? Or overlooked once more, their contribution buried like the seams they worked? We leave those questions open as coal wagons rattle out of the pits into the daylight, feeding furnaces that kept Britain alive. By 1942, the demands on Britain's coal industry had reached new heights. The war consumed fuel at a rate few had imagined possible. Every furnace in every factory seemed to burn hotter. Every locomotive demanded more steam, and every household needed warmth in winters that felt colder with each passing year. For miners, this meant shifts lengthened, quotas rose, and accidents multiplied. Tonight, we follow the steady, grinding rhythm of those years, when men and boys descended day after day into tunnels, already echoing with fatigue. A miner's shift began long before the first pick struck coal. Men woke in cramped houses still dark from blackout curtains, their breath visible in cold air. Breakfast was simple. Porridge, if oats could be had, bread with dripping, or jam if rations allowed. Then came the walk to the pithead, boots crunching on frost or mud, lamps swinging at their sides. The queue for the cage, the elevator that carried them down, was silent except for coughs and the creak of metal. Each man checked his helmet, his lamp, his tally token, knowing that a day underground meant facing dust, gas, and the constant possibility of collapse. Once in the seams, monotony set in. Picks struck with dull rhythm, shovels scraped, carts rattled on rough rails. Coal dust clouded the air so thick that visibility shrank to a few feet. Sweat mixed with grime until skin was indistinguishable from rock. Noise was constant, the clatter of machinery, the thud of falling coal, the drip of water from roofs. Yet even in this din, silence was feared. A sudden hush might mean a roof was shifting, timbers groaning under strain, gas building unseen. Meals were brief. Men crouched in shadows to eat bread and cheese, washing it down with weak tea from dented flasks. Conversation was sparse, often limited to muttered complaints or jokes about supervisors. In such conditions, humour was a chasse, eld. A joke, however grim, could break the weight of repetition. Accidents grew common as quotas rose. Timber supports gave way, trapping men under rock. Gas explosions lit tunnels with brief, deadly fire. Water seeped into shafts, flooding passages before crews could escape. Each disaster meant funerals in mining villages, chapels filled with women in black, children too young to understand why fathers would never return. Yet the next day, cages still descended, lamps still lit, and work resumed. The war did not pause for grief. Strikes simmered beneath this pressure. In 1942, miners walked out in several pits, demanding better wages and safer conditions. Newspapers condemned them as undermining the war effort. But within mining communities, the strikes reflected exhaustion more than rebellion. Men who had spent months working double shifts for little recognition felt forgotten. They knew their labor kept factories running, yet they also knew their lungs filled with dust and their bodies bore scars that would outlast the war. The arrival of Bevin boys added tension. Drafted teenagers, often from cities, arrived with little knowledge of mining and less enthusiasm. Some resented being sent underground instead of into uniform. Miners who had worked since boyhood saw them as outsiders, untested and clumsy. Yet in time, camaraderie grew. Shared danger broke barriers, and young men learned quickly that survival depended on cooperation. Still, the adjustment was not smooth. Accidents increased when inexperienced hands mishandled tools, and tempers flared when quotas suffered. Above ground, families shouldered burdens. Wives stood in ration queues, patched clothes, and managed households often without heat. Children carried coal scraps from rail yards or scavenged wood to keep fires burning. Illness spread easily in damp homes, coughs lingering through winters. Yet communities endured. Neighbors shared food, mothers traded recipes for stretching rations, and chapels organized aid for widows. Life above mirrored life below, survival built on routine, repetition, and solidarity. Fatigue wore at both body and spirit. Shifts stretched to 10 or 12 hours, leaving little time for rest. Nights were filled with coughing, the sound of boots drying by stoves, the faint rumble of distant bombs. Sundays brought respite, though many still worked maintenance underground. Football matches and brass band rehearsals offered relief, brief escapes into normalcy. Yet even these moments carried the weight of war. Players and musicians were often missing, serving elsewhere, or remembered only as names on casualty lists. By late 1943, a sense of weariness settled over coalfields. Men asked whether their contribution would ever be fully acknowledged. Soldiers returned from leave with medals and stories. Miners returned home with bruises and black dust in their lungs. Government broadcasts praised heroes of production, but in villages where accidents had claimed fathers and brothers, such words rang hollow. Still, the work continued. Cages descended, lamps lit, picks struck. Each ton of coal fed a furnace somewhere, powered a ship, or heated a hospital. Each wagon rattling out of a pit represented survival not only for Britain's war effort, but for the families who depended on it. Pride and bitterness coexisted, woven into the same fabric of daily endurance. And so the question deepened. How long could this hidden army sustain such effort? Could bodies already bent by years of labor endure another winter of quotas and shortages? Could families bear the weight of grief while still calling their men heroes? The answers lay not in speeches or newspapers, but in the tunnels themselves, where the rhythm of picks and shovels continued without pause. By 1943, the war's demand for coal pressed harder than ever. Armaments factories expanded, steelworks poured out tanks and ships, and railways carried troops in endless convoys. All of this depended on steady deliveries of coal, which in turn meant that miners could not slow, could not rest, and could not escape the dark seams where their lungs filled with dust. Tonight, we stay with them in that year, tracing how exhaustion, illness, and the need for recognition shaped life underground and above. For the miners, nothing changed outwardly. The same routines marked their days: the early walk to the pit head, the cage descent, the endless rhythm of picks and shovels. Yet bodies betrayed the strain. Men coughed more often, hacking up black phlegm after each shift. Eyes watered constantly from dust and gas, skin cracked from sweat and grime, never fully clean despite scrubbing at washhouses. Underground, men joked about their miner's tan, coal dust so ingrained it seemed permanent. Above ground, wives and children recognized them by the tired stoop of shoulders, the rasp in their voices, the dust that clung even after baths. Accidents showed no sign of easing. A missed timber could mean a collapse, a poorly vented tunnel, a deadly gas explosion. Newspapers rarely reported such incidents in detail, but within mining villages everyone knew the toll. Chapels filled weekly for funerals, hymns rising in voices hoarse with grief. Each service was brief. War left little room for lingering. But the weight of loss pressed on communities where nearly every family had someone underground. Children walked past pithead gates each morning with the unspoken fear that their fathers might not return. Government inspectors monitored quotas closely. If a pit failed to deliver, warnings followed. Managers pushed crews to extract more, cutting corners on safety when necessary. Men grumbled, but refusal was unthinkable. A delay meant less coal for ships, less power for factories, fewer trains on rails. And so they continued, shoulders bent under both rock and responsibility. The Bevin boys faced particular struggles. Many were still learning the craft of mining, and the experienced crews sometimes resented their presence. Yet over time, shared hardship forged bonds. A teenager drafted from London or Liverpool learned quickly when paired with a veteran who had spent decades underground. Together they faced the same risks, the same coughs, the same aching muscles at day's end. In quiet moments, older miners taught younger ones tricks. How to listen for the groan of a shifting roof, how to test for gas with a flame, how to pace themselves to last a long shift. Above ground, families carried on under rationing. Food remained scarce, queues long. Mothers stretched meals with carrots, oats, or dried milk. Children scavenged coal dust from heaps outside pits, pressing it into clumps to feed home stoves. Homes remained damp and drafty, blackouts enforced each night. Yet communities found ways to endure. Choirs practiced in chapels, football clubs gathered whenever enough men were free, and neighbors shared what little they had. Illness deepened as months dragged on. Miner's lung became common, though doctors seldom used the term. Men complained of constant breathlessness, of exhaustion after climbing stairs, of coughing fits that kept them awake at night. Still, they returned underground, driven by duty, wages, and pride. Many knew the damage was permanent, but in wartime there was no space to address long-term consequences. Survival today mattered more than health tomorrow. Recognition remained a sore point. Soldiers in uniform received public thanks, medals, and parades. Miners received ration books and weary nods. Government broadcasts occasionally praised heroes of production, but many in coalfields felt invisible. They asked, would their labor be remembered when peace returned? Or would they slip back into obscurity, their sacrifices buried deeper than the seams they mined? The weight of monotony pressed hardest. Shifts blurred together, seasons marked only by changes in the chill above ground. Underground, it was always the same. Darkness, dust, dripping water, the clatter of carts. Men counted days by tallying wages, by noting accidents, by remembering which funeral had been most recent. Small joys punctuated the monotony. A flask of strong tea, a song sung quietly in a tunnel, a letter from a son serving overseas. These fragments of normalcy carried men through endless repetition. By late 1943 and into 1944, Britain leaned more heavily than ever on its miners. Demand never eased, even as the war turned in the Allies' favor. Each ton of coal still mattered. Each furnace still needed feeding. Miners felt both pride and resentment, both determination and despair. Pride in sustaining a nation, resentment at being overlooked, determination to keep going, despair at wondering how much more could be asked of them. And so the question sharpened. Would the end of the war bring recognition or only more of the same? Could miners hope for better conditions, or would they return to obscurity once the guns fell silent? These doubts lingered in tunnels filled with dust and silence, unanswered as picks struck rock and carts rolled once more toward daylight. By 1944 and 1945, as Allied victories mounted abroad, Britain's miners continued their unending routine below ground. News of Normandy landings, of advances through France, of bombers striking German cities filtered into coalfields. But underground life changed little. Shifts remained long, dust thick, accidents frequent. Tonight, we close the story of Britain's hidden army underground by reflecting on their place in the war effort and the uncertain legacy they carried into peace. Victory in Europe brought no sudden relief. Coal remained indispensable, powering factories still producing weapons, trains carrying troops, and ships transporting supplies. Even as celebrations erupted in cities, miners returned to pits, lamps in hand, boots caked with mud. For them, victory meant more work, not less. Families hung bunting in villages, chapels held Thanksgiving services, yet by dawn, men were once again queuing for cages, descending into shafts where darkness swallowed the sound of bells and parades. Recognition for miners was uneven. Government leaders praised them as soldiers of production, but ceremonies focused on armed forces. Soldiers returned with medals pinned to uniforms. Miners came home with dust in their lungs and aching joints. Some felt bitter, their years of sacrifice overlooked. The Bevin boys in particular carried resentment. Many had served underground against their will, drafted by lottery, and when peace came they were denied veteran status. For decades their service was scarcely acknowledged, their role hidden in the margins of history. Yet within mining communities, pride endured. Families knew the cost and the contribution. In chapels and union halls, men spoke quietly of keeping furnaces burning, of meeting quotas despite shortages, of carrying Britain through winters when homes would otherwise have gone cold. Children of miners grew up hearing, not of medals or battles, but of fathers who returned each day covered in dust, alive despite the dangers. The health consequences were lasting. Many miners emerged from the war with lungs scarred by coal dust. Their strength diminished long before age should have claimed it. Black lung, bronchitis, and chronic exhaustion became lifelong companions. Accidents had left others with injuries, limbs crushed, hearing lost, backs bent. These wounds rarely made headlines, but they shaped the remainder of men's lives. Families adapted to caring for disabled fathers or brothers, households reshaped by the invisible cost of wartime mining. Communities themselves bore the marks of those years. Villages clustered around collieries carried memories of shortages, strikes, and funerals. Brass bands, chapels, and football clubs provided continuity, but the shadow of wartime labor lingered. Even in times of celebration, remembrance remained close. Names of miners lost in accidents joined names of soldiers on memorials, etched into stone in market squares and churchyards. Historians later argued that coal was as vital to Britain's survival as aircraft or ships. Without fuel, no factory could produce, no train could run, no home could endure the winters of war. The miner's contribution, though lacking glamour, was essential. Logistics and production mattered as much as battles, and coal was the foundation beneath both. Yet this truth was often slow to gain recognition in public memory. The Bevin boys campaigned for decades before receiving official acknowledgement. Not until the 21st century did they receive medals recognizing their service. By then, many had passed away, their contributions long overlooked. For traditional miners too, recognition remained mostly local. Plaques in pit villages, exhibitions in regional museums, stories passed down in families. And so their legacy lives less in grand memorials than in the quiet endurance remembered by those who knew. It lives in the songs sung by colliery bands, in the stories told at union meetings, in the pride of families who knew that their fathers' toil had kept Britain alive. It is a legacy of persistence more than glory, of routine more than drama. As peace returned, miners faced familiar struggles, disputes over wages, fights for safety, and the ever-present danger underground. The war had ended, but the work had not. In this sense, their story was unfinished, carried forward into post-war decades of strikes, closures, and reforms. Yet when we look back on the war, their role becomes clear. They were, in every sense, an army, hidden underground, unseen by most, but sustaining the fight above. Their battlefield was dust and darkness, their weapons picks and shovels, their victories measured in tons of coal delivered. They carried Britain through its darkest years, though they themselves remained in shadows. And so we close this story here. In the coal seams of Britain, where men laboured unseen, their sweat and sacrifice woven into the fabric of victory, their legacy still echoing in the silence after shifts. When lamps went out and only the dust remained, from the coalfields of Britain, We turn now to the far side of the world, to wartime Japan. Here, another story of endurance unfolded, not among soldiers or workers, but among children. As Allied bombing raids grew heavier, the Japanese government ordered evacuations from major cities. Millions of boys and girls were sent to rural villages, temples, and distant relatives. Their lives were reshaped not by battle, but by separation, hunger, and the monotony of rural routines. Tonight, we begin their story with the moment of departure. By 1943, the danger was clear. American bombers had begun striking industrial targets, and officials feared the firebombing of cities. The government issued orders. Children in urban schools were to be evacuated to the countryside. Parents wept quietly as they packed bundles of clothing, small blankets and notebooks. Children lined up outside classrooms, wearing simple uniforms and carrying satchels, each tagged with names and addresses. Trains stood waiting at stations, their carriages crowded not with commuters, but with small passengers clutching hands and fighting tears. The departure scenes etched themselves into memory. Mothers bowed low, fathers offered stiff salutes, younger siblings cried. Teachers led groups aboard trains, calling names, checking lists, herding children who scarcely understood why they were leaving. For many, it was the first time away from home. The whistle blew, steam rose, and carriages rolled away, carrying the future of cities into uncertain exile. Life in the countryside was meant to be safer, but it was never easy. Villages struggled with shortages already. Rice was rationed, fish scarce, clothing patched and repatched. Families who took in evacuees did so out of duty rather than abundance. A child might sleep on a straw mat in a corner, share meals of barley mixed with sweet potato, and work alongside. Foster families in fields. The contrast with city life was stark. Daily routines became those of farm children. Rising at dawn, carrying water from wells, weeding rows of vegetables, tending silkworms or chickens. School continued, but often outdoors or in temple halls, with lessons shortened by labor demands. Teachers drilled students not only in reading and arithmetic, but also in patriotic songs, military exercises, and air raid drills. Play was rare and brief, often improvised with sticks or stones. Loneliness pressed hardest. Letters to parents traveled slowly, censored and delayed. Visits were rare, limited by wartime transport and cost. Children clung to small tokens from home, a scarf, a photograph, a doll wrapped in cloth. At night, they whispered to each other about city streets, shops, and festivals left behind. Some cried silently under thin blankets, comforted only by the presence of classmates sharing the same fate. Villagers, too, felt the strain. Extra mouths to feed meant tighter rations. Some families welcomed children warmly, treating them as kin. Others resented the burden, offering little kindness. Evacuees quickly learned to adapt, swallowing hunger, working diligently, avoiding complaints. Resilience became survival. The monotony of rural life wore down the sense of adventure that some children had carried at first. Days blurred into weeks. Wake, work, eat little, study briefly, sleep on straw mats. Seasons marked the passage of time. Spring planting, summer heat, autumn harvest, winter cold with little fuel. Children learned the cycles of farming, knowledge unfamiliar to urban lives. They pulled weeds until their backs ached, carried bundles of firewood, and lined up for meager bowls of millet porridge. Teachers emphasized discipline. Uniforms were expected even when clothing grew threadbare. Marching drills filled mornings, patriotic slogans filled lessons. Some schools trained children in simple tasks for the war effort, gathering scrap metal, weaving cloth, or producing ropes from straw. The line between education and labor blurred as the nation bent all effort toward survival. Letters from cities carried both comfort and fear. Parents wrote of shortages, of blackouts, of neighbors killed in raids. Children wondered if their homes still stood, if their families were safe. News spread of firebombings reducing districts to ash. The distance between countryside calm and urban destruction widened, deepening the sense of exile. Friendships among evacuees became lifelines. Children shared stories, traded bits of food, whispered dreams of reunion. In the absence of parents, they leaned on one another, forming bonds forged by shared hardship. Teachers, strict in lessons, sometimes softened in private, offering small gestures of care, a second helping of barley, a word of comfort at night. And yet, questions lingered in every heart. How long would they remain away from home? Would their families survive the raids? Would they return to cities intact, or to ruins? For many, the uncertainty weighed heavier than hunger or labor. The future stretched out as an unanswered silence, filled only by the rustle of fields, the drone of cicadas, and the faint echo of bombers far away. So we leave them here, standing in temple courtyards and village fields, their small figures bent to chores, their thoughts drifting always back to parents and homes unseen. By 1944, the evacuation of children from Japan's major cities had become a settled fact of life. What began as an emergency measure stretched into months and years. For the young, exile in the countryside was no longer temporary adventure, but daily reality. Tonight, we follow these children into the second full year of their rural lives, when shortages deepened, discipline hardened, and the war's reach grew even into remote villages. Food was the most constant concern. Rations shrank steadily as the war consumed resources. Rice, once the staple of every meal, became rare. Children ate bowls of millet, barley, or sweet potatoes, often bulked with chestnuts, beans, or even acorns ground into flour. Protein was scarce. Fish seldom reached inland villages, and meat almost never. Families stretched supplies with pickled vegetables, miso soups thinned with water, or wild greens gathered from hillsides. Hunger became a daily companion. Children adapted by foraging. They collected chestnuts in autumn, mushrooms after rains, and edible grasses in spring. Teachers organized groups to gather acorns, which were dried, ground, and mixed into flour despite their bitter taste. Some children trapped insects or collected snails to roast. These small supplements eased, but did not erase constant emptiness in stomachs. Discipline in schools grew stricter. Teachers, pressured by authorities, emphasized loyalty and endurance. Lessons often began with salutes to portraits of the emperor. Children recited patriotic slogans, marched in formation, and sang songs praising sacrifice. Physical training became daily, running laps, practicing simple military drills, carrying sandbags as if preparing for combat. Even young girls were expected to display toughness, weaving ropes, hauling wood, or assisting in fields without complaint. Punishment for disobedience was harsh. A child caught hoarding, food might be made to stand outside in cold or to copy patriotic phrases hundreds of times. Tears were discouraged, seen as weakness. Teachers reminded pupils that Japan's survival depended on their discipline. For children far from home, these messages mingled with loneliness, creating a heavy burden of duty. Work consumed much of each day. Boys weeded rice paddies, repaired dikes and hauled water. Girls tended silkworms, collected firewood, or wove straw into mats and ropes. During planting and harvest seasons, school hours shortened so children could help in fields. Fingers blistered, backs ached, yet work was expected without question. Many evacuees raised in cities had never labored this way before. Their bodies adjusted slowly, though exhaustion lingered. Seasonal rhythms structured their lives. Spring brought planting, the drone of insects, and lessons outdoors beneath budding trees. Summer was blistering, with sweat soaking thin uniforms as children worked in paddies. Autumn harvests meant long days collecting rice or sweet potatoes. Winter pressed hardest, cold winds through drafty wooden houses, fuel scarce, meals reduced to thin gruels. Children huddled together under blankets, breath visible in unheated rooms. Letters from home became rarer as the war worsened. Postal delays stretched into months. Some letters never arrived. News carried whispers of firebombings in Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. Children asked teachers if their families survived, but answers were vague, censored. Rumors spread quickly. Entire neighborhoods burned, schools destroyed, thousands killed. Evacuees lived in a fog of uncertainty, torn between the relative calm of countryside days and fear for unseen parents. Among themselves, children sought comfort. They shared morsels of food, swapped stories of city life, whispered in dormitories about memories of festivals, street vendors, or tram rides. These exchanges became lifelines, reminders of identity beyond chores and drills. Teachers sometimes allowed song or play in rare moments, but most days were consumed by work and silence. The strain showed in health. Malnutrition stunted growth, left cheeks hollow, ribs visible. Skin diseases spread, lice-infested bedding. Colds lingered in damp rooms. Medical care was limited to herbal remedies or home treatments. A fever might confine a child to a mat for weeks, recovery slow without proper food. Some evacuees died, buried quietly in village cemeteries far from their parents. For surviving children, these losses deepened the sense of isolation. Psychologically, too, burdens weighed. Some grew withdrawn, speaking little, eyes downcast. Others acted out, fighting or refusing tasks, punished swiftly. Loneliness led to night tears, muffled sobs under blankets. Teachers responded with discipline rather than comfort, believing endurance was the highest virtue. Yet friendships among children softened the weight. A shared smile, a hand offered during chores, or a song sung together became small refuges. For villagers, the presence of evacuees was double-edged. Some treated them kindly, offering warmth and sharing food. Others resented mouths they could barely feed, viewing children as burdens imposed by distant officials. Evacuees learned quickly to adapt to each household's temperament, offering labor in exchange for tolerance. Grateful children remembered kind foster parents for life. Others carried memories of neglect or harshness. By late 1944, the gap between official rhetoric and daily reality had grown wide. Government posters urged cheerful sacrifice, but hunger and exhaustion dulled enthusiasm. Children saluted portraits and sang patriotic songs, yet privately longed for home. They wondered whether they would ever return to cities, whether parents still lived, whether the war would ever end. And so we pause here, among children bent to chores in muddy fields, their small hands raw from labor, their thoughts fixed on distant families. Their world had shrunk to hunger, discipline, and uncertainty. Yet still they carried on step by step, day by day, waiting for an end none could yet imagine. By 1945, the evacuation of Japan's children had become more than a precaution. It was a separation that defined an entire generation. In the cities, firebombs rained down, reducing neighborhoods to ash. In the countryside, evacuees listened to distant rumbles, watched smoke rise on horizons, and wondered whether their families had survived. Tonight, we follow them through that final, harrowing year of war, when fear, hunger, and disconnection shaped every day. The raids on Tokyo and other cities cast long shadows across villages. News filtered through in fragments. Neighborhoods gone, thousands dead, parents missing. Letters arrived late, often charred or censored, sometimes never arriving at all. For many children, silence became the only message from home. Teachers tried to soften rumors, but whispers spread. Classmates' homes destroyed, whole districts flattened. Evacuees carried these fears into fields and classrooms, their thoughts always half in the cities they had left. Daily life in the countryside continued its rhythm of labor. Children rose at dawn, worked in paddies, collected firewood, and attended lessons laced with patriotic slogans. Yet the monotony was pierced by dread. Air raid drills were practiced even in rural schools. Pupils ran to dugouts, crouching in earth shelters while teachers barked orders. Sometimes bombers passed overhead on their way to targets. The roar of engines shook walls, even when no bombs fell nearby. Each sound reminded children that safety was never absolute. Hunger grew sharper. By 1945, rice was nearly absent from meals. Sweet potatoes dominated diets, often boiled into watery soups. Millet, barley, and chestnuts supplemented rations, but portions shrank. Children scavenged constantly: nuts, grasses, insects. Teachers encouraged collection drives: acorns, medicinal herbs, scrap metal. Each contribution was tallied, praised, as patriotic duty. But stomachs still ached, ribs still pressed against thin skin, and fatigue deepened. Malnutrition showed plainly. Growth slowed, illnesses lingered. Skin diseases spread in cramped dormitories, lice-infested bedding, and coughs echoed through nights. Without proper medicine, teachers resorted to folk remedies: herbal teas, poultices, or saltwater gargles. Deaths were not uncommon. Graves in village cemeteries grew to include children far from their parents' care. Emotionally, the toll was heavy. Loneliness deepened with each month of exile. Younger children cried themselves to sleep. Older ones grew quiet, withdrawn, staring into distance. Some clung fiercely to memories, whispering city songs or sketching familiar streets in notebooks. Others hardened, burying grief under obedience and work. Friendships provided relief. Whispered talks at night, shared morsels of food, moments of laughter in fields. These bonds became a fragile shield against despair. Teachers struggled too. Many enforced discipline harshly, demanding silence, endurance, loyalty. Tears were punished, complaints dismissed. Yet in private moments, some softened, offering an extra bite of food or a kind word. They too bore the strain of shortages, of guiding children through fear they could not ease. Villages themselves felt the weight. Extra mouths to feed drained already limited stores. Some households treated evacuees as family, while others resented them as burdens. Children quickly learned to read the moods of adults, offering labor in exchange for tolerance. Gratitude toward kind hosts endured lifelong. Bitterness toward harsh ones lingered just as long. By summer 1945, the scale of bombing reached unprecedented levels. Evacuees saw the sky glow at night, distant cities burning. They smelled smoke on the wind. Rumors spoke of Tokyo nearly destroyed, Osaka gutted, Nagoya flood. Attend. The gap between official propaganda, assurances of strength and victory, and the reality of destruction grew impossible to ignore. Children sensed it. Even if unspoken, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki added new layers of fear. News was slow, censored, confusing. Teachers mentioned only that terrible new weapons had been used. For children already haunted by firebombing, the thought of greater destruction only deepened uncertainty. And then came the abrupt end. The Emperor's voice, broadcast on crackling radios, announced surrender in language few children fully understood. For evacuees, the meaning was clear only gradually. The war was over, and they might return home. But what would home be? Would parents be waiting? Would houses still stand? Would familiar streets exist, or only ruins? And so we leave them at this moment of uncertainty, thin, weary, marked by hunger and fear, standing on the threshold of return. They had survived exile, but survival carried its own scars. The question now was what awaited them in the cities they once called home. When the war ended in August 1945, the long exile of Japan's evacuated children drew to a close. Orders were given for their return to cities, and families, if they survived, prepared to reunite. Yet the journey back was not a return to the past. For many, home no longer existed. Tonight we close their story with the slow, painful process of going back, of finding families, of walking through ruins, and of living with memories that shaped their lives long after the war. Trains carried children once more, this time in reverse. Stations filled with thin figures carrying bundles, teachers shouting names, and villagers seeing them off with mixed relief and regret. The rides were crowded, windows open to hot summer air. children staring out with anticipation and dread. They had left as pupils in neat uniforms. They returned as weary evacuees, clothes patched, faces lean, eyes older than their years. Arrivals in cities were sobering. Platforms were ringed with rubble, tracks twisted by bombings, buildings reduced to skeletons. Children searched for familiar landmarks and found only ruins. Families waited anxiously, clutching names written on scraps of paper. Reunions brought tears, embraces, and in too many cases, silence when expected faces were absent. Some children found only distant relatives or none at all, their parents killed in raids. Others discovered their homes gone, their neighborhoods erased. Daily life after return was defined by scarcity. Cities lacked food, fuel, and housing. Families crowded into shelters, temples, or half-ruined houses patched with salvaged boards. Rations remained thin, meals of barley and sweet potatoes continuing long after surrender. Clean water was scarce, clothing ragged, shoes worn through. Children accustomed to rural fields now faced urban rubble, scavenging firewood among ruins and queuing for hours at ration posts. Schooling resumed in makeshift classrooms, temples, community halls, even open lots. Teachers worked with salvaged textbooks, chalkboards propped against broken walls, pupils sitting on crates or bare floors. Lessons mixed basic literacy and arithmetic with the broader task of re-establishing normalcy. Children struggled to concentrate, haunted by memories of evacuation, separation, and loss. Psychological scars ran deep. Evacuees who had endured years in villages carried both resilience and wounds. Some returned stronger, accustomed to labor and hardship. Others returned withdrawn, struggling to reconnect with parents after years apart. Separation had changed both sides. Parents were strangers to children who had grown, and children were no longer the same as when they left. Awkward silences, misunderstandings, and grief often colored reunions. Many children also carried guilt. Those who survived wondered why friends had died in raids or in rural exile. Some felt ashamed of longing for home, while others lost theirs entirely. Dreams were haunted by fire, by hunger, by the loneliness of nights in dormitories. Few spoke openly. Silence became a common language for a generation that had seen too much too soon. Communities tried to rebuild. Markets reappeared amid ruins, stalls of sweet potatoes and cloth patches offering signs of life. Neighbors gathered to clear rubble, patch roofs, and reopen shops. Festivals returned in muted form, lanterns strung amid broken streets, drums echoing where houses once stood. For children, these events offered glimpses of joy, reminders that life continued. Yet absence was everywhere. Gaps in families, in streets, in memories. In the long term, the evacuation left lasting marks. Former evacuees often spoke of the discipline and hardship they endured, of how they learned to work, endure hunger, and obey strict rules. Some saw it as a harsh education in survival. Others remembered it as trauma, years stolen from childhood. Bonds formed in exile lasted into adulthood. Classmates who had shared hardship often remained lifelong friends. The evacuation became a shared memory, shaping how a generation understood war, family, and endurance. Historians later debated its value. Did it save lives by removing children from bombed cities? Certainly many survived who might otherwise have perished. Yet the cost in separation, hunger, and trauma was high. Some argued that evacuation revealed the state's willingness to sacrifice childhood for survival, reflecting a society bent entirely toward war. For those who lived through it, the legacy was not abstract. It was in the taste of millet porridge, the memory of walking fields barefoot, the sound of distant bombers. It was in reunions that healed, or in absences that never closed. It was in the quiet resilience that shaped post-war Japan, a generation marked by endurance, cautious hope, and the determination to rebuild from ashes. And so we close this final story. The evacuated children of Japan were not soldiers, not workers, but their war was no less real. They carried hunger, discipline, and fear through years of exile. They returned not to the homes they remembered, but to ruins, and from those ruins they began again.